So let's think about what goes into a typical consumer's shopping basket. When the BLS is going around doing this survey for US households, they are talking about what goes into your shopping basket, and people are answering and giving them names of thousands and thousands of goods and services that go into the shopping basket. Ultimately, we can construct a pie chart to look at the different categories that those expenditures fall in. So here, this pie chart shows you the components of the CPI. Notice that the blue right here, in blue we have housing. Housing is what most Americans report takes the biggest share in their shopping basket, about 42%. Followed by this dark green, this forest green over here, which is transportation. That's the next biggest category, followed by food and beverages, which is about 14.8%. And then you have other categories like medical care, recreation, education and communication, apparel, things like that. Okay. Now, one thing to think about might be, how would a young person's shopping basket differ from an elderly person's shopping basket, right? So if you think about it, maybe this category right here for medical care or health related expenses would be much higher for an older person than for a younger person. And for a younger person, this category might actually be higher. So education, because you're spending on either taking out student loans or you're paying for room and board, things like that, all of that would fall into education. So one thing to remember is that this is just a pie chart that is for an average or typical consumer. And this is just an average. This is not reflective of your consumption basket only. Okay. So each number is showing the percentage of expenditure for a typical household. Okay. So we can say now that CPI is it's used as the basis of cost of living adjustments in many contracts, and it is used to adjust social security payments. This is sort of the use of CPI. Once we know that we've accounted for what goes into everyone's shopping basket, we are able to use that, CPI inflation in particular, to adjust salaries or wages in contracts and even social security payments that are handed out, because prices can go up or down over time, and this needs to be reflected in the paycheck. Okay, but there are some problems that, while CPI is useful, there are some problems that are associated with the CPI. In general, CPI overstates increases in cost of living. This is about 0.5% or 1 percentage point. So why does that occur? Why does CPI overstate the increase in the cost of living? One factor is that there is a substitution bias. So recall that CPI is using a fixed basket of goods and services in their survey. So if consumers become smarter and over time they're able to substitute towards goods that are relatively cheaper, the basket is going to shift, and this effect is going to be missed in the CPI calculation, because CPI uses a fixed basket of goods and services. So it tends to overstate inflation, but not by too much. It's still a very useful indicator of what's going on with prices. The second factor that causes CPI to overstate increases in cost of living is the introduction of new goods. So think about iPhones, for example. When iPhones came out, You probably got rid of your iPods or CD players or other types of MP3 or music players, or maybe you were too young to know that all these things existed. But iPhones had a lot more functionality, and when you're using a fixed basket of goods to compute inflation or measuring the level of prices, again, you're going to be overstating the cost of living or the increases in cost of living, because you're going to miss that effect. You're fixing the basket in such a way that you don't allow for that flexibility. A second example would be think about gift cards. Think about, for example, a Macy's gift card versus a Visa gift card. Now, maybe earlier we only had Macy's gift cards and no Visa gift cards. Macy's gift cards would restrict you to a particular store, which is Macy's, and Visa gift cards are just more versatile. You could use it anywhere, and you would obviously prefer this, right? So again, when we are looking at gift cards in our consumption baskets or expenditure baskets, shopping baskets, we are going to miss that effect if gift cards became more versatile or offered us more freedom in terms of spending. And here's a fun fact. In California, if you have a gift card that has $10 or less on it, we all have gift cards that have $10 or less on it, you are able to go to that store that the gift cards belongs to, and you can ask them to give you cash instead of that. Okay, so you don't need to always spend $15 to get rid of that $10 on your, or use up the $10 on your gift card. Okay, but this is just in the state of California. So we're lucky. There was a law passed long ago that allowed us to do that. Okay, so the third factor that helps us understand why CPI would overstate inflation is because there are unmeasured quality changes that occur over time. So an example would be, if you think about this year's Honda Civic, that is going to offer you better gas mileage than last year's model. And so quality changes are really hard to do or account for, are difficult to account for. So even though your basket is going to show that you were buying a Honda Civic last year or this year, and this year's model happens to be more fuel efficient, your cost is going to be lower if you bought this year's model versus last year's model. And CPI is going to miss that effect because it is going to look at the general level of prices, okay, and not look at the quality change that happened. The next thing we're going to turn to are the differences between CPI and GDP deflator. So one thing to recall here is when we talked about GDP, recall that GDP was given by Y equals consumption, right? This is GDP. This is the expenditure on all final goods and services produced in a given country in a fixed period of time. So you have consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Here we are correcting for anything that fell into consumption, investment, and government spending that was produced outside of the United States. Okay, so when we are talking about GDP, we are not accounting for any imports. So when we think about imports, they are not accounted for in GDP deflator. But what about the CPI? When we are asking consumers what goes into your shopping basket, the shopping basket is not only going to have goods that are produced in the United States, but the shopping basket is going to have goods that are produced outside of the United States. So imports are included in the calculation of CPI. And this is one big difference between GDP deflator and CPI. That's why when we are measuring cost of living, we typically talk about CPI inflation and not GDP deflator. Okay. The next thing is the inclusion of capital goods. So if you think about machines and equipment and tractors and other things that are heavy duty industrial goods, you would find that because these goods are produced in the United States, these are typically included in GDP deflator, but an average consumer in America is not going to tell you that this goes into their consumption basket. So capital goods aren't included in the CPI. Finally, we know that CPI uses a fixed basket of goods, right? And for GDP deflator, we know that this uses a basket of currently produced goods and services. So here's an application that tests your understanding of whether you know the differences between the CPI and the GDP deflator in the following scenarios. So this is a good time to pause the video and look at your three options. Okay, so let's talk about the solutions. The first one says Peet's raises the price of espressos it sells. Now, Peet's being an American company, any espresso that Peet's is going to sell is going to be included in our GDP. So the GDP deflator is definitely going to rise with the price of espressos going up. And when we think about the CPI is also going to rise because most American consumers are going to have Peet's espressos in their consumption baskets or shopping baskets. Next, let's look at part B. General Motors raises the price of buses it manufactures. Now, if you think about CPI, a bus or many buses is not something that goes into an average American's or typical consumer's consumption basket. And so CPI will not change. But GDP deflator will, because General Motors is an American company. And so buses are becoming more expensive, and so GDP deflator is going to go up. Okay, next, Mercedes raises the price of cars it sells in the US. Now, notice that if we think about a typical consumer, they are going to report that they do buy Mercedes, and so CPI is going to go up, but GDP deflator is not going to change because Mercedes is not an American company. It's a German company. Okay.